Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to our webinar this morning about surveys. Your hosts for the day, your cruise ship directors for the day are Katie and myself, Becky Stewart. We both work at a company called the Improve Group. And we'll be talking to you about our surveys today, sharing some of our experiences. We've both been working at our firm for a while and have used surveys with a variety of clients in a lot of different contexts and for a lot of different purposes. So lots of different kinds of surveys, and we'll try to sprinkle some of that experience in today. I would say one of the things that I always enjoy a lot about my work, and is also really powerful, especially with surveys or really anything else, is that we pay attention a lot to making our evaluation and any tools that we're using, like surveys, really responsive to the community and the context in which you're using them, which can really help result in very useful and powerful data. And so that's a challenge and that I enjoy, and I'll try to think of some good tidbits to sprinkle in today about that. Katie, do you want to share a little bit about your background?
Happy to. Thanks, Becky. So my name is Katie Twyman Metzger. I also use she, her pronouns. I have been with the Improve Group for a year now. And prior to working with the Improve Group, I kind of kept returning to violence prevention and specifically issues related to sexual health. Um, Especially coordinating and managing programs related to violence prevention. Um, which included our evaluation of said programs. So I am especially excited by figuring out what promotes people feeling comfortable sharing information on what can be a sensitive topic or a challenging topic for a lot of people, and kind of promoting that sense of openness and engagement and evaluation.
Thanks, Katie. Well, we know from registration that many of you are already doing a lot of evaluation, so that's wonderful to have that you're bringing that experience. And some of you are not feeling quite so deeply immersed in evaluation. That's just fine too, and hopefully there's something to take away for everyone today. We were asked to do this webinar by the Minnesota Department of Health Sexual Violence Prevention Group, and they asked us to focus on surveys based on some of the feedback that they've heard from grantees and partners and others in their network over the years, where folks were sometimes feeling there's some challenges that they were having or uncertainties about how best to use surveys or how to update existing surveys. So again, hopefully the content here today will be helpful for those kinds of circumstances. And just a little bit about the Improve Group. We are a worker-owned evaluation consulting cooperative in the Twin Cities in Minnesota. We work with nonprofits and foundations and government around the state and in different parts of the country as well. We've been in business for about 25 years. Um, and the work that we do, we provide evaluation, planning, facilitation, and community engagement to support these mission-driven organizations. All right, and then just a little bit of housekeeping. Here we have on our Zoom webinar. Some of you may have been on Zoom webinars so many times, and others maybe not so much. So we just want to make sure you know what tools you have to use. So you'll see at the bottom of your screen a little toolbar that should look like this black toolbar here, with on the left-hand side an audio button. to adjust your audio. Then going to the right, there's a chat button. The chat's disabled for this webinar. Then there's a Q&A button, which is you can use any time to submit questions, and we'll pause to answer questions after each break. If you are having any technical difficulties, please use that Q&A button. We've got our eye on that, and we'll see if there's something going on there. We can try to help you out. So use the Q&A button for that as well. I hope that you've noticed that we've got we will be generating a transcript. That's the next button over, as well as a recording from this session, and those will be available to you afterwards. The next button over is show captions. We have a CART captioner supporting us today if you'd like to turn on captions. And finally, as I mentioned before, we are recording this. You'll be able to have the recording as well as a PDF of the slides content, so you don't need to take notes on absolutely everything today. Here's what we're thinking for our agenda. We're going to start with kind of what to think about when to use a survey. Then we're going to talk about some tips, things to consider for survey administration. Then we're going to go into what are the different parts of a survey to make sure you're including all the parts of the survey that you should. And then we'll take a break. We have a plan during our break to give you some time first to practice some of the skills that we've been talking about. And then we'll also just have some time for a break because we'll all need it. After we come back, we'll answer questions that you've raised in the Q&A, and then we will move into talking about survey questions and how you write good survey questions. What are some things to pay attention to? We'll have another break, and then we'll talk about response options, again, how to write or create good response options and things to pay attention to. We'll take another break, a little practicing. And then we'll go into analyzing and interpreting your data, sharing and using results. And as long as our time's going okay, we'll try to do one more little practice break at that point. Okay, first, just to set the bar, I've got sort of a terrible poll or survey for you to take. We have our first poll here, I'll launch it in a moment, is how do you feel about surveys? And we have choice number one, a cat that looks very upset about doing surveys. We've got choice number two, a cat that's not feeling very good about doing surveys. Choice number three, a cat who's feeling happy about doing surveys. And choice number four, a cat that's feeling over the moon about doing surveys. So that's probably not the most brilliant of survey response options, your cat options, but we we'll just kind of playing around with a little bit of a survey here to see how you feel about them. So can everyone see our cat poll? Choice number one, frustrated. That's a frustrated cat there. And then choice number two, dissatisfied. Choice three, satisfied. And choice four, delighted. Right, so if anyone wants to participate in the poll with how they're
Becky, I think we need to relaunch the poll.
relaunching of the poll.
Would you
Okay.
like me to do that?
Sure.
Okay, please let us know in the Q&A if you still aren't seeing
Oh,
that, but I see responses coming in,
yeah,
so I think we're on the right track.
great. Let's give another minute or so here for our poll. Thanks for participating. Almost everybody. I'll give you one more second here. Great. Well, I'm going to end our highly rigorous cat poll. And we have folks who are, a few who are delighted, and then probably an even mix between those who are satisfied and dissatisfied, and no one who's totally frustrated with surveys. Great.
All right, this is Katie, and I am briefly going to take us through some advantages, disadvantages of using surveys and considerations to keep in mind when deciding if using a survey may be the mode of data collection for you and your organization to use. I think first we're going to talk about some advantages. So if you want to proceed to the next slide, Becky, I think you got it. Okay, so um, just to kind of make sure we're all on the same page about what we're talking about when we're referring to surveys in the first place, um, surveys compared to other modes of data collection tend to be pretty highly structured. And usually only contain close-ended questions, meaning people aren't entering, kind of a stream of consciousness reflection, um, or that they have limited options to select from. Um, One of the great things about surveys is that you can administer them in a number of different ways. Um, we see surveys offered online oftentimes in this day and age, but alternatively, it's also pretty common to provide paper surveys to folks or to offer surveys in person for people, especially who um, may prefer or need that option available to them. Um, One of the other excellent things about surveys is that you can offer surveys across different groups with whom you're working or serving, and then use the survey results to compare differences or similarities across those groups. Um, it can be pretty easy compared to some other data collection methods to get a lot of people involved in surveys, especially in the day of the QR code. It can be, or the hyperlink, it can be easy to reach out to a lot of people in a quick amount of time. Um, Especially when considering some of the subject matter that may be relevant to you all working in sexual violence prevention. Um, it is great to know that surveys can kind of mix sensitivity with a participatory nature, so you can engage your survey participants in something that may even be fun. For example, using cats, perhaps, to collect some information, or also tailoring your language to address more sensitive topics. All right, why don't we chat about some disadvantages? So there are things that you want to consider that may influence you to not go the survey route, or that in your design may influence some of how you frame your survey for individuals. Um, one of the um, things that we mentioned previously is that because surveys often have limited responses that an individual can provide, it can sometimes be hard to extrapolate why or how people got to the answers that they got to, or why or how a program is offering specific results. It can also take a little bit of work behind the scenes to ensure that um, respondents are going to read and answer your survey questions in the way that you intended. Um, and that technically your survey is working well as well. Um, it Also, we've noticed that we live in an age where there are a lot of surveys that people are asked to participate in. Um, I know I personally get text messages frequently asking me to fill out surveys about this, that, and the other thing. People may experience what we could refer to as some survey fatigue and not be particularly enthusiastic about participating in yet another survey. Um, Lastly, there are some groups of people who, or individuals who, for other reasons, um, may not feel that surveys are accessible or desirable to participate in, given the subject matter as well. Um, we have a few additional considerations that may influence your decision in whether to participate or whether to offer a survey for your evaluation methods. Um, the first consideration um, is uh, so taking a step back for a moment, um, we really want to consider uh, what is actually going to elicit the most response from the people who you actually want to hear from. So if an individual um, is highly likely to participate in all of the questions that you're asking, but other groups who may not participate in your evaluation methods as frequently are the only ones who are going to answer your survey, uh, given certain outreach methods, how you're connecting with people to participate in your survey. That's something you're going to want to integrate into your plans for your survey methods early on. Um, Second, um, considering what data sources your key audiences will consider to be reliable. So when we refer to key audiences, um, that could be the population that you're surveying, but it could also be your grant funders, your board of directors, anyone who's going to be looking at this information, and kind of relating or inferring things based on your survey responses. Um, Considering what they will deem to be credible or legitimate in the kind of response or the results or takeaways that you're finding from your survey results. Um, Lastly, do you actually have the resources necessary both to collect data using a survey? In many cases, this can refer to kind of technical accessibility as surveys are hosted online. But additionally, if you anticipate that you will have people who want to participate in a survey in person, do you actually have someone to offer that survey in person? And kind of extending from that, do you have individuals or the capacity to analyze the data in a way that is rigorous and will get you the results that you need? Yeah, I'll pass to you, Becky.
This is Becky. So we want to talk a little bit about survey administration, some of the advice that we would have for helping this to go smoothly. First, just a few terms that you may have heard. So first of all is the term sample, and essentially that is who is selected to participate in your survey. And there's a lot of different kinds of sampling that you can do, including kind of complex statistical sampling, which is sometimes what people think of when they hear the word sampling. That's for many circumstances with programs. Trying to understand if things are having an effect or where they can improve their program. That's not necessarily needed, that kind of level of rigor. So that's just something to remember that sampling has a lot of different definitions, and mostly you just have to remember it's who is selected to participate in your survey. Another thing you need to pay attention to is response rate, and that is who you actually heard from. And so it's the people who took the survey, and then divided by the people that you were invited to or selected to participate in your survey, which is your sample. So that percentage is the percent of people who responded to your survey and is your response rate. And there's some considerations um, about that. When we're looking at the response rate for us, we're thinking about have we heard from enough people to give us confidence in what we're um, hearing on the survey? And that's perhaps also within that, who did we hear from? Is we know that we've got participants from rural and urban areas, or we know we've got participants who are younger or older, and who did we actually hear from in our response? And that helps give us more or less confidence that our response rate is good or is giving us something that we can feel confident about taking those results and using them. Another term that comes up a lot is generalizability. And that's the ability to draw conclusions about a whole population. And again, that is, in our experience, pretty rare for those who are doing program evaluation. When you are wanting to understand the folks in your program and you're not interested in trying to understand if the results will universally be true across the whole population. There may be times when that's really helpful to you, and it usually comes with some cost. So perhaps you're doing planning for a really big effort, and you do need to have that strong confidence about a whole population. So thinking about that ability to justify a major investment, or the stakes are high, and you really do need to be able to talk about a whole population. Um, And then lastly, we just wanted to say mostly you need to know that how to talk about the data that you have is most important. So as long as you are being transparent about what your results do or don't represent in terms of who was asked to take the survey and who responded, that clarity is most important when you're presenting your results. And as you're thinking about with your use, what kind of level of confidence do you need to have with the use that you're planning for your survey results? Oops. So just a note about response rates. As Katie mentioned, we all get a lot of requests for surveys, and that has not been helpful for our response rates. So an employee survey where you sort of have a little bit of a captive audience, those response rates can be higher at 60 to 90%. And we've seen that in when we've got a really well-connected and close group of participants in a program, for instance. Um, so those you may be able to get to those higher response rates when those circumstances, when people are really close to you, you've got strong relationships, you've got great contact uh, information, you've been able to think through how to reach them and give them time to do the survey in a way that works for them. All those things coming at their best might give you a response rate that good. Customer and member surveys, so that's people who maybe are not quite as close. and they are associated with you. They maybe been to a training or in the past, or maybe saw some of your materials that are out there. Um, those are going to be lower response rates. And finally, if you're just putting something out to like a general group who doesn't have very close relationships with you, you're going to have the lowest kind of response rate. And again, um, there's been a lot of work in our field to talk about practical significance. So, can you kind of look at your response rate and feel like that is giving me enough confidence that I feel that we can use these results for the purpose that we want to use them for? And that's really what you're trying to pay attention to. And then boosting your response rate. We're especially finding that this is important, an important part of your survey cycle. And there will likely be times when you wish that your response rate was higher than it was. So, some helpful practices. There's some old reliables in here. We know that providing an incentive does help. We also know that giving lots of reminders helps. As you know, we're all bombarded with a lot of information, and people may intend to take your survey and have just lost it in the email box or in the pile of texts. And so reminders help. Also thinking about making it easy to take the survey. And so that is, as Katie was talking about earlier, there's different modes of online or paper, or do you give people time to do it during um, a program session if that's appropriate. So just trying to find ways that make it easy for people to take the survey. Another one is asking for encouragement from those participants know and respect. So we are working with a small program that does violence prevention work, and many of their participants took a pre-survey at a big event that they, kind of a kickoff event. And for those who didn't attend and weren't there, they got the link. But I will tell you that we got the results back from them, the responses back from them after the mentors who are involved with the program asked for them to pay attention to that pre-survey and get their response in. And then finally show why it matters. And a lot of that is showing how you will use results and making sure that people know that you have used results before from surveys and that you intend to listen to what they say and apply that. Whether that's for making an improvement or a change or a new offering in your program. But that's important for people to feel that it matters. So then this is also something that you think about ahead of time and put those things in place, but also as your survey is out there, you are monitoring survey participation and thinking, if your response rates are low, what can I do? So, some of your boosting actions that you might have identified, if you want to double down on those, um, we've had, times where we were trying to get responses from college students, and we had those professors and teachers, TAs mentioning the survey in classes too, to try to get those folks who they might trust and get some reminders to them a different way. Getting positive publicity. So if there's great if you can get some word out. Maybe the program that I mentioned before with the violence prevention, they do a lot of social media campaigns too. So letting folks know that maybe sharing some of the results from prior year surveys to show how it's used and how the survey is valuable could be a great way to get some publicity. Targeted outreach. So if you know, as you're watching your results, that there's some groups that are not responding as much as you know that are in your sample, that you can do some targeted outreach, and that might be directly to them. That might be finding somebody that's particularly in there. We talked about it, somebody who they trust or a source of information that they pay attention to, and you can kind of double down on getting the messages out that way as well. And then finally, consider a mode change. We have had some times when we had an online survey out and we weren't as satisfied with results, especially from some groups. And we did go to a different mode. So maybe we did some phone surveys and reached out to them by phone and said, "Hey, can we take a couple minutes to do the survey together right now?" That may be there's a lot of things to think about there, but that there might be some modes that work better for some folks than others. And then as you're considering what mode to use, you're thinking about how to make it easy for your desired respondents. And for all of these things, when we say, what's easy for them or what mode will work best or who would they trust um, to get messages from about the survey, how would you know this? The answer to all of these questions is by talking to people and getting advice from people who are in that community that you are trying to reach. And I'll just take a moment here to plug that as a really critical practice throughout your evaluation and throughout your survey process. That is a form of expertise of knowing that community well and knowing what will work the best for them and what will might be a better option. And by having some advisors who you pay for that expertise on your team to give you advice as you're making these design decisions or troubleshooting during data collection is really valuable. I'll just give another example. With that violence prevention program in Wisconsin, they had a small group who was doing their surveys, and some of the folks thought some of the youth thought that it would be easiest or helpful for them to do a paper survey, which honestly surprised me, but they felt like that might prompt their peers to take a little bit more time because they knew that, like, for instance, journaling is really kind of a valued habit amongst their peers. And it might feel a little bit like journaling if they were given some time to do some reflection and make some notes and also fill out the survey on paper. So that was some helpful advice, and like I said, it surprised me, and did was really helpful. And we got some great results, really good response rate, thoughtful responses on the survey. Also considering mode, thinking about what's easy for you. Obviously, you cannot do an online survey if you don't have ways to reach people online, or a phone survey if you don't have ways to call people. So thinking about what information that you have. Also, not forgetting that there's some of those modes might come with data entry. So if you are not doing it online, if you're doing it on paper or something, there will be data entry to do afterwards. And just remembering what will make it easiest for you to do analysis. And we'll talk about more about analysis later on and what makes it a little bit easier. And finally, as we're talking about modes, we also want to, I mean, the cat survey was clearly silly, but there are other ways of doing surveys that are not just on paper or online and might help boost some participation or response. So they also might be most appropriate for different kinds of circumstances. This is an example. We've got a picture here where we had a survey that was done by people dropping tokens in canisters. If you look closely, you'll see those canisters look a whole lot like Pringle cans with some covered in colored paper. And then they've got the responses in labels on the can. So one can says, "I agree," another one, "I disagree," another one says, "I'm not sure." And then the survey question is presented in front of those three cans. So, for instance, the one on the left says, "As a result of using the play and learn spots, I have learned about a new activity I can do to help my child's development." And then we've got a second question on the right. "As a result of using the play and learn spots, I feel more confident in my ability to help my child develop." So people could take a token and pop it in the canister that that um, best represented their response to that question. This is a survey, this is a form of a survey, and this one was in a drop-in activity. So those can be, again, the context is important. If people are very unlikely to follow up with a survey after having just dropped into an activity, maybe catching them for a very quick survey like this at the end gives you some insight and information to use. Um, and in another mode, this is the Pringle canister mode. And finally, we have a picture of spam here because we have been noticing a lot for ourselves, and maybe you have been too, that we are getting a lot of kind of bot surveys, especially if a survey link gets shared on in a public place. And really, especially if there's an incentive associated with it. So, if you can try to avoid getting your survey link out in a public place, that is, it will make your life a lot easier. We had to do a lot of work sometimes to get separate out the surveys from people who are in our intended sample versus, bots or, other folks that are not in our intended sample, but just saw the link and wanted that incentive. Um, Let's see. So you can think about some things to do besides just avoiding putting that link out in a public place. Some qualifier questions at the beginning might be helpful. So if they can answer the questions correctly, so that you know that they are in your intended sample. You might also have some qualifier questions that would be likely for only those who are in your intended sample to be able to answer correctly. So maybe some things about the place where they took a training or something like that, or a location that where training happened versus some locations where training didn't happen. So just some ways to try to filter out some of the kind of not real answers. Um, Definitely add a step before they get an incentive so that you have a chance to review the survey data and see if you can determine if it is like a real survey or a more of a bot survey, and make sure that they're eligible for the incentive. And also asking for some information from them in order to give them the incentive, we've found does have a discouraging effect for those who are just trying to click through and get an incentive. Okay, so now we'll try another poll here to see approximately how often you have been asked to take a survey in the past 3 months, and then how frequently you have taken those surveys. All right, are we seeing the poll this time? Yeah, great. All right, looks like we're slowing down a little bit in our poll responses. Last call here. Okay, well, it looks like about half of you are getting a survey request once or twice a month. Another quarter about weekly, and then some tail ends here of folks who are hardly ever getting surveys, or those who are getting them multiple times a week. So we're seeing surveys fairly often, I would say. And then we have our results about how frequently we take them. And we're more often here not taking them. So we've got about 40% hardly ever, or 80% total, hardly ever or occasionally taking surveys. 20% of you lovely people are often taking surveys, and 3% of you take it every time, and you have the best survey karma. I confess to being an occasional survey taker, and I always feel that I am not doing myself any favors it's going to come back to me in my next survey and some due retribution that I didn't take the survey. All right. Well, that's just a little bit of a dose of reality that we all get a lot of survey requests and don't always respond. So again, making it as easy as possible, encourage getting that encouragement to folks, and doing some things to boost your response can help. Katie, I think I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. This is Katie again. So next we're going to talk about the actual parts or components of your survey, starting with a common structure that you can refer to when designing your own. It's important when designing your survey that you always start with an introduction, and that typically includes a few specific things. It's important to note, first of all, who is actually conducting the survey. So in our case, at the Improve group, since we're often consulting with different organizations or agencies, we'll say this survey is conducted by the Improve group on behalf of this organization. That way, your participants actually know who is getting this data. Um, it's also important to clearly identify how the information will be used. So if you're using it to make improvements to your program, that can help participants or respondents to the survey feel a little bit more secure in why they should be giving you the information they're giving you. Um, and along side that, um, it's sometimes helpful to include who will actually be seeing the results of the survey. Um, and included in that is this aspect of anonymity, which can especially be important to consider when talking about or when surveying individuals about topics that they might not be inclined to uh, share their experiences or beliefs about super openly. If the survey responses are anonymous, it's nice to state that as plainly as you can. And again, also um, clarify if there is any identifying information about who's participating in the survey, who is actually seeing that identifying information. Um, Next, we have a section on consent in our survey structure. This is typically conducted a couple different ways. So you could just include a message that says, by continuing in the survey, you consent to participating in, um, to having your information used in these ways, or that would be considered passive consent. Um, Alternatively, you could give or ask for active consent, which oftentimes can look like clicking a box or putting your initials to indicate that you do understand how this information will be used and you consent to the information being used in that way. Um, Next, you would move into the actual questions of your survey, and you'll see that we have as on point three questions followed by point four sensitive questions. We recommend putting sensitive questions uh, or questions that people may find a little bit more challenging to answer towards the end. Um, Primarily for the benefit of having built some rapport or trust from respondents in your survey by the time they get to these questions. Essentially, I'm like realizing I am a sunshine blob. Um, hopefully you can see me better. Um, by the time they get to these sensitive questions, then um, the hope is that individuals will have a little bit more trust in the questions that you're actually asking of them by the time they get to those sensitive questions. Um, and they may be less likely to opt out of answering those sensitive questions at that point. Um, we after that recommend going to your demographics, so asking about some of the demographic characteristics of your respondents. These questions are typically easier for people to answer. Um, and as people get a little bit more tired or worn out as they proceed with the survey, these demographics questions tend to be a little bit of a lighter lift to end on. Um, Lastly, uh, providing a closing and a thank you. I also like to include a reminder of here's what we're actually doing with the survey, just to refresh people's memory because I sometimes see that people will ask that after the fact. Um, and then relating to incentives, if you are providing an incentive, it's important especially when you are conducting a survey anonymously, to make sure that the incentive information is collected separately from the survey response. You don't want to compromise a person's anonymity by asking them the email address that you're going to send their gift card to, for instance. So in our case, what that often looks like is at the end of the survey, providing an additional link to a secondary survey where people can add their contact information so those things aren't linked together. There's your structure. A quick note about one option for survey design, which is the pre-post survey. And as the name kind of implies, um, in this design, you're offering a survey before or pre-participation. And then offering a second survey after or post us program participation. Um, there are a couple advantages to using this method. Um, the primary one is that it allows you to see actual change in the responses that participants are giving, um, which while we can't make a claim about the actual cause of this change necessarily based on the data we're collecting, it does increase your ability to make an argument of what that change was associated with. Um, I'll give a quick example of what of one case where I have used a pre-post survey design. Um, I coordinated a program where youth participated in kind of education about violence prevention and conflict transformation. They learned a whole bunch about how to intervene in conflicts, and we asked them about their likelihood to intervene before participating in the survey and then again afterwards. So we could see that change in how people felt they may intervene um, after having experienced that program. Um, One of the challenges of pre-post surveys is it requires you to have the same people surveyed before and after participating in the program. Um, and additionally, some people um, may have a hard time answering questions accurately in the pre survey, meaning if they aren't familiar with a concept, for instance, they may not know how to, they might not have the knowledge necessary to answer that question as accurately as possible. All right, we can
This
go to
is
the next
Becky.
slide.
I'll just jump in with
Yeah.
another example on this that I had where um, sometimes when you're asking about knowledge, for instance, in a program that we were looking at, um, some knowledge about root causes of violence, and the participants, the client really wanted to use a pre-post survey, and it worked fairly well in for most things. But the participants said that they felt confident about their knowledge, or um, they said that they had a good understanding of some things. And then the more that they learned, the more they realized that perhaps they only understood a small portion of the root causes of violence, or they understood them in a new or different way after participating in the program. So that's just one way where your pre might not be give you as great an insight, especially on those kind of people's own understanding of their level of knowledge on something.
Thank you, Becky. This is Katie again. Um, so one option to kind of mitigate some of the cons that can come with the pre-post survey is to conduct a retrospective pre-post survey. What that means is people are still reflecting on their experience before and after participating in something, but you're only surveying them afterwards. So they're retrospectively thinking about their experience before participating. Uh, so you would, for instance, ask, how much would you say that you knew about this concept before or when you started the program or before starting the program? And now that you have finished the program, how much would you say you know now? So again, revisiting those cons, this kind of solves the issue of having inconsistent participants because you're only asking them to participate in at one time. Um, and you know that they have a consistent kind of baseline knowledge to refer to these questions with as they're participating in that survey at that one point. Um, all right. So do you want to jump in, Becky? Oh, I believe you're muted.
Thanks, Katie. This is Becky. We're at our first break, and first started, you should have received an email from me yesterday with a Word document. And that Word document has some suggested activities. So we're going to take 10 minutes now to do to just have to be able to practice and think about some of the things that we've just been talking about. So during here, let me share your Word. You should get a Word document that looks like this. Should have been in your email yesterday. You can take 10 minutes and think about current use. We talked about when surveys are a good fit and not a good fit, and you might think about how am I currently using surveys, or I'm not, and I'm considering it. Is that really a good fit for using a survey? You also might take a look at an existing survey and see if it has all these components or all these parts of the structure. And finally, another activity that you could do for the next 10 minutes is think about who could you go to for some advice along the way in the survey process. So this is somebody who's kind of firsthand knows about your potential survey respondents and would be able to think about, is a survey a good way to reach them? What would encourage them to take it? What's the best mode of doing that survey and things like that? And then how might you compensate them for this consulting? Um, are they are providing you with that expertise, and how can you recognize that with some compensation? So it's 9:54 now. We'll give you some time to practice, 10 minutes. So that's 10:04. And then we'll have a little bit of a break just to step away for our computers after that. So we will just take 10 minutes now to do some of those practice activities, reflect about the use of a survey, the parts of a survey, and how you would get some advice. This is also a great time to put questions in the Q&A. uh, one signifier, but not every, but you don't always have that without kind of fancier survey software. One other thing that we have seen is where there's a write-in response, that a lot of times they're using language that is exactly the same because it's off of a script. So satisfaction with something or something exactly the same to the word, and you'll get multiple responses that look exactly the same. Another one, when I was talking about sort of qualifying questions, sometimes if we'll ask, what city do you live in and what county do you live in? And people who are just kind of, or just if those answers are chosen at random, then they won't match what you know, that city is in that county or that county is in that state. So that is another sort of any of those qualifying questions that people need to have some knowledge to sort of connect the dots between this is a program site or this is correct geographical information. Some of those things can give you an insight that someone's just choosing answers at random, like a bot versus an actual participant or person. So that's just a couple of things. It is a challenge in the survey world now, for sure. Next question is, as you're thinking about a survey, as are you thinking about a survey as a first line of evaluation? As in, does this seem to be the lightest load for most people? Do you have specific recommendations about survey length, such as number of questions, time needed to complete, etc., and how this might encourage greater participation? It's a whole bunch of good questions. So, I would say a survey can feel like a light lift in that people can do it in a few minutes. At the same time, I would say just remember that, again, it depends on the kind of data that you want and need. So if you need to understand why or how something is working or what the needs are in a real nuanced or deep way, a survey might not be a great option. I'll also say that sometimes people enjoy other forms of data collection. So they might enjoy getting together with other folks and having a conversation in a focus group, or they might enjoy um, telling you a story about their experience and get frustrated by having to just use the close-ended survey responses to try to describe an experience. So again, that goes to it's not necessarily always the first and best choice. You have to think a little bit about who you're trying to reach, what they will and if you what they will enjoy, and the data that you need from it. I think surveys can feel like the easiest for us to put out there in some ways, rather than recruiting people to a focus group and getting that all set up or taking the time to do interviews. But there's also a lot of thinking that needs to go into survey design. So I think it can be the quickest for people, but I wouldn't always say that that's necessarily the lightest load. Sometimes it's an enjoyable load to tell your story to someone or connect with other people who've had a similar experience and talk about it together, especially if you're feeding them. And definitely, so the next question is about recommendations on survey length, such as number of questions or time needed to complete. I would say that is one of the benefits of a survey is that it can be quick. So if you're doing something that is going to take more than 10 minutes, it's going to be hard to get people to complete, and you're going to start losing people. And then you start worrying about your response and who decided to stay on and finish this long survey and who didn't. So trying to keep it for sure less than 10 minutes and just we're going to talk a little bit about how you make sure you're getting just enough questions and not too much in our next section. But I definitely, yes, definitely keeping the survey as it's a valuable opportunity, so you need to get what you need to get from it, but you also need to keep it as short as possible because the longer it gets, you will start losing people. And that affects your response rate and can bias your results in terms of who has stayed on to answer all your questions. Um, Great. I think those are most of the. Oh, here's another great one. Can surveys be used to help conduct a needs assessment? Have you experienced any examples of this? For sure. So we have done some needs assessment or kind of community assessments to understand, yeah, what's needed, what priorities are. So that can be really great. Again, We had a community organization that was trying to think about which services were most important, especially maybe as they were considering needing to cut back, and especially complemented with some other maybe qualitative data collection to help you understand what choices to put out there. So once you get maybe some good sense of what choices to put out there about priorities, then you get that in a survey, and then you can go really broad across a community with like, do these feel like the most important needs for our program to address right now? So yeah, definitely putting something out that's about prioritization or for a needs assessment or what resources are already out there or might be missing. And you're trying to go broad and understand things across a lot of people. A survey can be great for that. And we are recording and we'll be sharing this recording afterwards. That's one last question. So thank you all for your great questions. Katie, I'm going to let you take it away with survey questions.
Yes, thank you, Becky. This is Katie again. Bear with me. I'm going to pull up the slides. All right. So just to uh, oh, it looks like this screen sharing did not work, if I'm getting that right. Let me try one more time. Okay, is Becky, are you able to see the screen?
Yeah, looks
Fantastic.
good.
Thanks for confirming. So just as a refresher of where we are at currently, we have just finished our break. Hopefully you had some good time to reflect over the questions and the activities. And moving forward, the next thing we're going to cover is survey questions and some specifics around how to design that. Um, so broadly speaking, there are two types of survey questions. We've described close-ended questions a little bit already. Um, and sorry, I'm going to toggle back. Bear with me on some technical things here. So there are two types of survey questions. Close-ended questions are questions where there are only a limited number of responses that a participant can choose from. Open-ended questions can include short answers, things where participants can really choose how they're responding and use their own words to answer the question. Um, once you start asking questions about a program or an organization, um, there is a tendency to want to know everything you possibly can. And as Becky was just describing, you really don't want to go over about 10 minutes of time. And also, you want to consider the amount of resources that you actually have to go through the responses. That people are actually giving you. You want to, in advance of actually designing your survey, come up with some evaluation questions that will help you define what you actually want to learn, or what is most critical to learn from your survey responses. We have a few examples of evaluation questions here. Um, a distinguishing point here is that your evaluation questions are kind of an umbrella under which your survey questions are going to live. So they're not intended to provide you a single data point. They are more there to kind of help you define the boundaries of the evaluation. And to define later survey questions that are consistent with the ultimate takeaways that you're hoping to walk away with at the end of your evaluation. Um, a few examples here. We have how well have we designed the program to fit the needs of those who we intended to impact? What change are we contributing to as a result of our efforts? And are our efforts worth the resources that they take? So hopefully you can see how these are um, broader questions that we can then support with specific survey questions. Next we have a table here. I will speak briefly in a moment to what we actually see in the table. Um, but we really want you as a critical step here to help define how what your evaluation questions are, what your survey questions are as they relate to your evaluation questions, um, and then what you're actually planning to do or learn from your survey responses. So, just to describe this table visually, in the far left column, in a dark blue color, we have a column for your evaluation questions. Again, this is what you want to learn about. Um, your survey questions in the second to the left column would correspond then to each evaluation question that they are trying to support or answer. Um, in the third from the left column, we have your analysis plan. This is what you are actually going to do with the responses or data that you collect from the survey questions. If you're going to be looking at specific subgroups, so smaller populations within who participated in your survey, this is a good chance to make a note about that, or really anything that you plan on doing with that data. And lastly, on the far right column, uh, we have a space to note for each survey question what you are actually hoping to know or be able to say based on the responses of that survey. This is really a valuable opportunity to make sure that your survey is the right size. If you as you start brainstorming questions, it can help you make sure that you're not just asking a million too many questions about that relate ultimately to only one evaluation question, but not really addressing other things that you've noted in your evaluation questions that you want to learn about. Um, the analysis plan also helps you think about um, the actual resources that you'll need in order to uh, respond or analyze this data. As I was describing, connect any demographic variables or specific kind of context about the populations that you're working with to your analysis and your survey questions. Um, and in that last column, try out statements that you can make with the data you will collect. Um, if those aren't helping you answer your evaluation question, then or give you meaningful answers, then you're going to want to go back and revise. I also find it helpful to think about what um, in the event that you have a funder supporting your program, what information are they actually going to want to know that or hear as it relates to your evaluation or survey questions that may be helpful in your reporting? So here we have an example of a filled out table. So um, On the far left column, we have what you want to learn about. This is your evaluation question, just kind of titled a little bit different in this example. So in this case, this program wants to know by the end of the program, um, period participants will improve or will they improve their beliefs about healthy relationships by a great deal, as evidenced in pre-post tests. Um, In the second to the left column, we have two examples of survey questions. We have number one, I can describe the difference between a healthy relationship and an unhealthy relationship. And number two, I voice those concerns. Uh, I, I voice concerns, excuse me, to those I love about their relationships. In this example, we also have provided the survey responses that would be included in each of in relating to each of these survey questions. Um, each of these has a scale going from, in one case, very untrue to very true with a neutral response in the middle. Um, and for the second question, never to always with the sometimes option in the middle. Um, and lastly, for the analysis plan, this program noted that they're hoping to compare um, overall percentages of each response before participation and after participating in the training. Um, so here are the results of a program. 65% of program participants told a friend about what they learned. Um, does this seem like good enough information? Um, or should is this a track that an indicator that they're on the right track with their programming? It's hard to say based on just this sentence alone. Um, Without providing context and interpreting these results, knowing just 65% of participants told a friend doesn't really actually tell you much. So it's important to add some context about whether they found the training powerful and helpful. Um, in this case, maybe last time they had this program, 75% of participants told their friends about the program, and there was actually some instances where people were complaining about the program to their friends um, instead of speaking positively about this. Um, so this is an opportunity for qualitative data or some of these open-ended questions to provide some additional information to form that context around the more discrete data that you're presenting, um, to kind of build that narrative of what's actually happening in relation to your program. Um, let's see. So a little bit of information about close-ended questions as an example here. Um, So, in a close-ended question, the respondent is asked to choose from a list of answer options. So, in the example in the table that we showed earlier, um, we had a scale from disagree to agree. Participants can only click one of those buttons. So that is a close-ended question. They can't put in their own words how they want to respond. Um, one of the strengths about this is that it asks less or burdens the respondent less than an open-ended question may. Um, it's also a little easier to quantify or analyze. A lot of people like to use percentages in particular in their analysis. And when you have scales or numbers that you're working with, it's easier to generate those results. Some limitations. Um, the categories might lead to people towards certain responses. Um, this especially may be the case if they think that they're supposed to respond in a certain way. Um, People might just click whatever option feels the easiest for them to click on without really thinking about it. And again, you might miss some important information if one of the options you provide, uh, or if there's information that isn't provided or covered in your kind of pre-populated responses. Um, you might not get information about the actual experience of your participants if you haven't anticipated all the ways they might want to respond. All right. So here we have a blue silhouette of a person with a few puzzle pieces uh, in where their brain is supposed to be. Um, we want to take a moment to recognize that when you are participating in a survey or really doing anything in your life, um, oftentimes we're thinking about more than just the thing that we are doing directly. That's true when people are participating in surveys as well. Um, I could be thinking, oh, I'm hungry. I need to go have something for lunch, and not necessarily thinking about the question that is in front of me on this survey. With that in mind, we as survey designers can take certain steps to make it easier to process the questions. Um, so here are some kind of hopefully highly specific tips that can help you guide your design process a little bit more specifically. In the event that you are asking individuals to rank items, um, please don't ask them to rank more than 5 items. After that point, it can get kind of confusing. If you do have more than 5 items where you want to kind of get a sense of people's opinions, it may be better to use a scale of intensity to indicate people's feelings about those items instead of asking them to rank them. Make sure your language is specific and concrete, excuse me. Um, Consider the reading level of your participants. Um, Oftentimes, sticking with about a sixth grade reading level is kind of common practice, but consider your population um, and how that may differ for them. Um, Avoid any jargon that your survey participants may not understand. And if you're using acronyms, make sure you define them. Um, Use language familiar and accurate to your respondents. This is particularly important when considering kind of cultural norms that may differ from one cultural group to the other. Use language that's familiar to them. Um, Make sure that all respondents can respond to all the questions. So in other words, make sure your questions apply to all respondents, or make sure you include a skip or does not apply option if you are limiting questions to specific respondents. Use as few words as possible while still using full and simple sentences. Make sure to only ask one question at a time. Don't load more than one question into a single item. Um, and avoid framing questions with negatives, as it's really easy to slip into double negatives in those instances. So a few things that we see happen often in survey design. It's really easy to lead people towards specific answers in how you are framing your question. For instance, if we ask, how excited are you to use these resources? That may influence someone completing the survey to think that they are supposed to be excited, and they may skew their responses towards that end of the scale as a result. Um, we also see double-barreled questions. This kind of falls into the line of asking two questions in one item. In this example, we have how often do you use the resources page and the helpline? This could really be two questions. How often do you use the resources page? And subsequently, how often do you use the helpline? Um, and lastly, when you have designed a survey, It's really important to keep the same questions, keep your survey exactly the same if you want to be able to compare any changes in responses over time. If you're asking people different questions at different points in time, then you're not going to be able to compare your results. So next, we are going to go through this advice from a firm called EvalWorks. Um, they refer to this as the Fantastic Five checklist for writing a better survey. I'll read what the Fantastic Five are briefly, and then we'll go through each one to go through some specific examples about what this actually looks like in practice. So number one is, can the questions be consistently understood across respondents? Two, does the question communicate what constitutes an appropriate answer via the question? Three, do all respondents have access to the information needed to answer the question? Four, is the question one which all respondents will be willing to answer? And five, can the question be consistently communicated to respondents? So let's start with consistent understanding. So as you are asking, as you're designing the survey question, you want to ask yourself, can the question be consistently understood? So, for example, if we ask individuals, how many times have you been hospitalized in your life? We might find people interpret being hospitalized in different ways. Um, so, for instance, do you count being born? Um, does a visit to the emergency department count, or is it only when you're actually admitted to the hospital? If you're using this language, people may interpret what you're or misunderstand what you're actually asking for. So, more specificity would be appropriate here. Number two, communicating what is a good answer. Um, Really, this comes down to including the kind of framing of your answer that you want your respondent to provide. So in this example, we have when did you first enroll at the University of Minnesota? Um, People might answer this in all kinds of ways. They could say, I started in September. I started 5 years ago. I started in 2011. These are all different types of responses. As opposed, or as an alternative, you could ask, in what semester did you first enroll at the University of Minnesota? Now we know the answer is supposed to be in a semester, and it's looking at your first enrollment. And in your response options as a close-ended item, you could also give the opportunity to select fall, winter, spring, summer, and an opportunity to select or enter a year. Number three, people should be able to access the information needed to answer the question. So, do all respondents actually have access to the information that they need? Uh, so, for instance, if you were asking someone in 2026, what amount did you pay in taxes in 2011? Um, I know speaking for myself at least, I would have to do some digging to find that information. And while I may be able to find it, it may take so long that I don't actually want to complete the survey by the time that I find the information that I need. Um, and so in this instance, it's important to take a step back and think, what information am I actually trying to understand by getting their information about their taxes? Is there another way that I can frame this that still gets me the information that I want or need while placing less burden on the survey participant? Um, this also brings up a point about using existing data where you can. Um, if you have uh, collected data on some demographic or income demographics related to a participant previously, are you able to combine that with identified survey respondents? at your current survey to pull that information from one survey to the next, as opposed to asking them to complete that or provide that information twice. Number four, can all respondents answer? Um, so is the question one that all respondents um, have the information to answer as we previously described, but also are willing to answer? Um, so think about again what you really want to know. So if you're asking, how often did you use, for instance, de-escalation skills in the last week? Um, you may encounter an issue um, where, uh, on one hand, people may not have experienced any opportunities to actually apply their de-escalation skills. And so the answer may be zero, but that's because not because they chose not to use those de-escalation skills, but because the opportunity was never made available to them in the first place. Um, Additionally, especially considering the subject matter related to sexual violence that many of you are keeping in mind, um, it can be beneficial to consider the level of sensitivity that the subject matter may have for respondents. So, for instance, if you're asking about bystander intervention, it may be useful to include a sentence that says, bystander intervention can be a difficult thing to do in the moment. Acknowledging that those behaviors are difficult then can reduce the likelihood that someone will respond in a way that isn't accurate in order to meet what they perceive to be the expected response. Lastly, consistent communication. Can the question be consistently communicated to all respondents? Um, so, for example, we have the question, how frequently do you see threatening activity at parties? Um, you will get better data if instead of just using the term threatening activities, you actually define what threatening activities may look like and ask respondents to rate how frequently they've seen that specific threatening activity. So maybe instead you could ask, how frequently do you see individuals touching one another without consent at parties or making verbal threats to one another at parties? Those are more specific and consistent examples of language usage. All right, Becky, I am going to pass it over to you to talk about demographics.
Thanks, Katie. This is Becky again. So, as you remember from the survey structure, after your questions are done, then you want to include a section on demographics and at the end of your survey. And again, we put them at the end of the survey because they are generally, hopefully, easier to answer. They don't require less thinking on the part of the survey respondent, and they can do them quick and maybe when they're feeling a bit tired at the end of the survey. Um, that they are really important to include because we know that the kinds of things that we're working on with like different issues in the community, that different groups experience those at different rates and in different ways, and or the kinds of programs that we do. We know that some things work for some folks and different kind of interventions or activities work for others. And the demographics part of your survey can really help give you important insight about, we talked about doing a needs assessment. So, do some groups in the community feel like this is a real priority and others do not? That could help you really target your activities to some areas of the community or not. So, it's critical to have a section like this to help you get the information that you need and that level of understanding that helps you adapt your plans and your programs to the actual people you're trying to serve. Um, so, and as you're thinking about what to include, then you're considering what are the important subgroups given maybe the different kinds of groups that you know are in the community or participating in your program. You might also be thinking about what others have learned through research or other programs and researchers have learned in terms of how groups experience programming differently or how they experience the issues that you're working on differently. And so you want to include those groups in your demographic choices so you can understand if that's going on for you. Um, so you're deciding on which questions to ask, just like with generally in your survey, you want to be ask the things that are important and meaningful and not everything. So you want to consider what's important and meaningful to understand about subgroups you're trying to under look at in your survey results. Um, Also, similar to how you'll be thinking about your survey questions in general, you want people to see themselves in these demographics. Nothing for all of us, it will turn you off more than somebody asking something about you or your identity and you don't have anywhere to answer. Like none of those answers fit me, and that's not a great feeling. And you are at risk of losing people. They will drop out of your survey. They may even get annoyed with you and your program and feel like it's not for them. So you want people to see themselves in the demographics. That's another place where you can get some great advice from folks about like what categories to use in the demographics in order for people to see themselves and have an option to choose that reflects their identity. So that's critical for keeping people in the survey and also for getting accurate data. It might feel like a shortcut to put other at some point with your identities, but that also can feel kind of crummy to people that you're an afterthought or not included as a standard kind of identity. So trying to really get a good, robust set of options for people to respond to, not using the word other, which can actually kind of feel like now you're othered or another not part of the main group. So again, you're trying not to turn people off with these demographic questions. Make sure they see themselves in them and get good, full, accurate data for you to work with in your survey. Um, so we've been talking a lot about closed-ended questions, but we also might have open-ended questions. And that provides, as Katie has said, an opportunity to provide a response in their own words. There are strengths to this. For instance, we might not want to influence the respondent with our choices of what their response could look like, and so we want to leave it open for them to answer in any way they would like. Um, or it could be that the reasonable list of possible responses is pretty long, and that would provide a lot of burden. It might be easier for people just to say it in their own words quicker. Or potentially maybe little information is known about the possible responses. We're not quite sure what the universe of responses is, and so we're not feeling very confident about creating those closed-ended options. Um, there are and I would add also that it's always good to have at least one open-ended question on your survey because you want to, if people have not been able to express something through the questions that you've offered that's important to them, you want to give them a space to do that. Again, it helps with them not being aggravated with you or your survey, and also helps catch those if you've overlooked some important insight or area of knowledge or change that you didn't think of. This allows it to come through in those open-ended responses. So just making sure that I would say at least have one or two in your survey. At the same time, because of some limitations, you don't want to have a lot of open-ended options in your survey, open-ended questions. So some of the limitations is they are more time-consuming to analyze. You're not going to do frequencies or percentages to summarize these questions. You have to do qualitative analysis, so that can take a little bit more time. You also are getting then into interpreting. What do people mean? Usually on a survey, you're only going to get a sentence or two, so sometimes it's even harder to interpret what people mean in that. And people are more likely to skip those open-ended ones. So you're going to get some amount of kind of non-response bias, or you're going to hear from some people and not others, and that might have to do with those people or their experience. And so give you a little bit of a bias in what you're understanding from those open-ended responses. I'll say a reason to consider limiting those is that we know that survey response starts dropping off when you get to the open-ended questions. So you start losing people kind of quickly. So that's a reason to only have maybe a couple on your survey. If you're finding that you need a lot more than that, maybe it's a sign that a survey isn't a good choice, and there might be another method that is a better choice. And then just a quick note, if you are doing the kind of open-ended um, questions where people are kind of filling in a blank, you just want to make sure, as you are with your other survey questions, being as precise as possible. So you're thinking through, how are people interpreting this question? We have two examples here of a poor design where maybe the question is, in an average week, how often do you cook dinner at home? And people might write in your box often or most of the time or only on the days when my kid doesn't have soccer practice, which is makes your life difficult for analyzing. So if you could give a little bit more information, tighten up that box for the response and say maybe um, blank and then days per week, 0 to 7. That gives people and more of an idea about what kind of answer you want and will make it far easier to analyze the data. So just then to wrap that up, repeating it for these open-ended kind of fill in the box questions, include the unit desired in the question stem, like the number of days. Include the appropriate size space for the response that helps signal to people what they're supposed to put in that space, not a sentence or a phrase, but something short. And then finally, include unit labels with the answer space. So number of days, for instance. Okay, well, you've earned another break. We do have some suggested activities in your, again, the Word document that you got by email, and those suggested activities are kind of working through that table, an example table like Katie went over, where you identify what you want to learn and come up with some survey questions that would help you get at that, at those learning questions or evaluation questions. You want to have more than one survey question for each evaluation question. Um, and then kind of playing that out to how are you going to analyze that and what is it going to say, and is that what can you say with the data that you'll get from it, and then testing to see whether what you're able to say gives you a good profound answer to your learning question. So kind of playing out that table. You can use an existing survey maybe to take your survey questions and map them to see if they're helping you get at your learning questions, or if there's any areas missing. Another activity you could do is look through existing survey questions to see if those fantastic five that Katie went over are in play, if you're being clear, if you're including two questions at once, if you're using jargon, kind of watching for some of those tips. So let's take, how about 7 minutes here until 11 o'clock to do a little bit of practice, and then we'll have a short break before we get into our next thinking about responses and analysis. So come back, move on to your break at 11 o'clock, and until then, why don't you try some practice?
This is also a great opportunity to reflect on any questions that you want us to respond to. We'll be checking in on those after the break. So please feel free to offer any questions in the Q&A function for us to check in on. Thank you.
Understood in the same way by everyone. As you remember, one of the fantastic five is that you want to have common understanding among everyone, and that's a great reminder about idioms. So thank you. Um, and great. Well, we've got some working next on some response options, as I mentioned, and then before we get to analyzing and interpreting data. So as you think through your response options, some things that we want to think about, again, these are closed-ended response options, is making sure to include a neutral or I don't know response if this is a legitimate response. Somebody may think that, so make sure to include it if that is a legitimate response. Make sure to align your question and response categories. We've got some examples of that coming up, but if you're asking about how the level of confidence, for instance, in your question, you want to make sure that your responses reflect that as well. As you're setting up your survey, you may want to think about how you're framing questions so that some statements, the desired response would be strongly agree, and in other questions, the desired response might be strongly disagree. And if you kind of mix that up, it helps interrupt folks who are just kind of going down the line quickly and choosing all the answers on the right. So a little bit of mixing that up is helpful. If you can avoid the use of always or never, that helps people not hesitate about things. It's rare that something always happens or never ever happens. And so trying to avoid those kinds of absolutes in your response categories helps make that people feel a little bit more comfortable indicating something as close to their reality. And then making sure that you're being careful that response options are mutually exclusive and also exhaustive. Likert scale. So we had a question about this too. So you're maybe familiar. These are the kinds of things like strongly disagree to strongly agree. They're kind of a range of options in your for your response options. And many scales have been shown to be effective and are used a lot. And you can Google those for even Google for ideas. A lot of universities have some quick sheets that'll tell you good Likert response options that you might be able to use. One positive thing about them too is that they are familiar. So many of them are very familiar to people who've done surveys before. And so that helps again with the processing. They've seen it before, and they're concentrating not on understanding what these responses are, but on thinking what they think about the question. Also, if you're trying to compare your survey results to a broader survey where there's some validated survey questions, uh, they are often using Likert scales. So again, those examples are the agree scale that we've got here of strongly agree, agree, neither agree nor disagree, disagree, and strongly disagree. Those would be some examples. That's an example of a really common Likert scale that can be helpful. And there's a couple different kinds, right, of scales. So ones are kind of two opposite poles. So you've got a really positive and a really negative, something like that. It's two ends of a scale, and they tend to have a midpoint. That might be, as we mentioned earlier, potentially helpful, like to have a neutral midpoint. So they're an odd number, 5 or 7 point scales. And so these are used when people can legitimately have like a very positive or negative response to your question. And of course, make sure that that's evenly distributed. It's not 5 of your 7 points are all positive and 2 are negative, but evenly distributed across your scale. You'll want to think about other scales that where you don't have necessarily a really negative experience. It might be there's nothing going from like a 0 or a baseline to something being positive or negative. So in that case, you're kind of thinking about the absence or the presence of an attribute. In this case, usefulness. So maybe something is not at all useful. That's the baseline. to something being extremely useful. So that's another way to think about really what are the possibilities for responses here? Is there really like a positive and negative, like two ends of the scale, or are you really going from a baseline of and thinking about the presence or absence of an attribute? Um, and as you're thinking about your question and wanting to make sure that your question aligns with your response categories, trying to think about making sure that you're not, again, leading with your question. So saying instead of to what extent do you agree with the statement, it is easier for people to find work in the community than it was a year ago. You might improve that by saying, to what extent do you agree or disagree with the statement? It's easier for people to find work in the community than it was a year ago. Next, we have an example of mutually exclusive answer categories. So this is, you'll see age categories here. So the first one goes 18 to 24 years old, and the next category starts with 25. So this sounds very obvious, but sometimes it's easy to miss where you've got a category overlapping and somebody might hesitate if it was 18, 25 or under, and then the next category started with 25. Somebody might hesitate or be confused about where to put themselves. Make sure that your response options reflect what you are asking in the question. So this is an example of an inconsistency where your question asked about how happy you were with the services, and the response options are about satisfaction, extremely satisfied, very satisfied, etc. So you'd want to probably use satisfied in the question stem and align that with your responses. Next, we have a couple tips about positive response bias. This can come up a lot with people when they're just really grateful for having had an experience or got some kind of desperately needed services or low-cost services or had a great relationship with the staff. They're often tend to give you really positive responses, and that's a positive response bias. And also makes it difficult for you to learn helpful things from your survey. There must always be things that you can improve or change. There's always things in the community to respond to if you're doing an assessment. So here's a few suggestions about how to look at limiting that positive response bias. So one, instead of asking kind of how satisfied you were with something, you might ask about an action that someone has taken because of to see whether they've actually taken an action because of their experience. So you might ask if have you recommended this program? And this is more specific. It's about an action they've taken in the past, and it's concrete. Another thing you might do is kind of test knowledge with multiple choice questions. So there's not one clear answer. So maybe you're asking about different behaviors that are helpful in a conflict situation, and you might provide a number of options, and they might be if sound relatively good, but really you recommended 3 of them, but you're including 5 or 6 of them, so that you're kind of seeing if people picked up on what you intended them to take away from the training or something. There's also some research about doing your Likert question in 2 stages that will help decrease the positive response bias. So for you ask the first question, are you sure or not sure, or are you um, did you have positive experience? And then you ask in the next question, how much? So how sure are you about that? Very or somewhat. So you ask whether something has occurred, and then you ask how much of it in a separate follow-up question, and that's been shown to reduce some positive response bias. And then we've got next asking about specific behaviors. So instead of saying, are you doing more of this? Or, but you get more specific about that. Are you doing this not every time, but most of the time? Are you eating not just more, but eating 4 cups? So the more specific you can be, that also helps. And then as you're playing out these different options, again, we just return to the more that you can kind of vet and pilot, get the advice for folks who are in that target population for whether you're getting questions that are commonly understood, and the choices that you're um, offering for responses are also making sense to folks. Another question that sometimes comes up in our work is about validated survey questions. So these are ones that are used a lot, maybe in like national tools like the sexual violence survey, the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, or the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance System, YRBSS. So some big national surveys. And is it helpful to use some of those questions in your own surveys? And we'll offer some benefits and drawbacks. So one benefit is that it allows you to compare results to elsewhere. So you know what the national average is or a broader average. There's a student survey in Minnesota. You would know what the Minnesota average is, or even broadly in the district. But and then you can compare that to your folks and kind of see if they're above or below that average. So that might that comparison could be helpful. And then you also have confidence that that question has been really carefully constructed and tested and used a lot. So that can give you some extra confidence, and that's a benefit. Some drawbacks are that validation may have been with a population that's significantly different than your population. So a lot of the validating of some big surveys has only happened with certain populations. And so the meaning might not translate well to your population or your community. And so it's helpful to remember that and kind of see if it needs some changes in order to be more relevant in your context. And again, going back to like you're trying to learn what you're trying to learn. And just because these questions are good survey questions, it may not be that they're good ways of answering your evaluation or learning questions. So you have to, again, kind of come back to those and think about what are you trying to learn and what survey questions are really going to get at that. Again, I mentioned a couple of these surveys. These are some other resources. We put together kind of a resource list for another client. So you these are examples of things you might think of. Here we've got a table with some different indicators and the data sources that they're coming from. So some of the examples here, data source of the Office of Post-Secondary Education has a campus safety and security analysis tool. So that might be something that's relevant for you for looking at some of these things. Or I mentioned that National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey or the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance System. There's also a health indicator warehouse or a national survey on child health. And those ones, there's just a number of different resources that you might go to if you are looking for some of those validated survey questions that you can use in your survey and compare your results. All right, and finally, we have a plane sailing off into the sunset here, ready to go. You've designed all these beautiful questions and answers, and just hold on, survey pilots, and take a moment to review your survey really carefully. It's difficult to look at all the layers of things in a survey at once, and so going through and thinking about, I'm just going to look at my responses and whether they are mutually exclusive and evenly weighted and using the same language as in my question stem. I'm just going to go through and look at my responses. And then another time you might take a pass through and look at your questions. So it's helpful to just do one layer at a time. And then also ask for some help and doing a little bit of a pilot, asking people to take the survey and tell you where they got confused. Or you could even sit with them while they take it and they can tell you how they're interpreting different questions. And that can give you some good insight into how things are being understood and if it's what you intended from your interpretation. All right, I think we are going to move into some analysis, and then we're going to do a little bit more practice. So let's or maybe we'll do our practice first. Let's pause here for a little bit of practice. So, and I appreciated in the text some good reminders for us to be careful that these are not just to remind ourselves and you that these are not just breaks. It's really helpful to get this information in your mind if you can practice some of it. So, as we go, and so if you can take a little practice here in we've got it under break 3, but we're just the activity here is to practice writing some response options for your survey questions, or you could review existing response options if you already have a survey. So this is an activity time for you to take a look at some of those existing responses that you have, or maybe if you tried your hand at writing some survey questions earlier, try writing out some response options, paying attention to the things we've talked about here in terms of the categories and maybe even some things you might do to adjust for positive response bias. All right, so let's take about 8 minutes here to 11:30 for you to practice with your responses on your survey questions, and then we'll come back and talk about analysis. This is Becky. We'll get hopefully some good practice with your response items there. And we'll answer a couple questions before we get into some analysis. So one question was about with Likert scales, whether a 10-point Likert scale or a smiley face scale or a 5-point scale is might be better to use. And specifically comparing can the scale be 5-point instead of 10-point, or will that sacrifice too much nuance? Um, so I would say, again, you're trying to think about kind of decreasing the processing time for folks. I think for many questions, a 5-point Likert scale is totally sufficient in terms of nuance. And it might even be harder for people to try to think, am I between the different categories, the more nuanced they get with the more choices that are offered. So I think I would probably tend towards a familiar 5-point Likert scale. That people are used to seeing and interpreting, just to, again, for that familiarity and kind of reducing the processing. There might be times when it feels like there really is meaningful. People could easily need to have that meaningful nuance with a lot more choices, but I think a lot of times that might just be add more difficulty for people trying to figure out, and then you're trying to interpret the difference, more nuanced differences. So in our experience, a 5-point scale works well most of the time. Um, and then, yes, in the resources, we can share some of the links that we had on us and as example on a slide there. And a final question with a note from a participant about being careful that if you're using items, that the folks who created that survey allow you to use items. And usually it'll say that, for instance, this is, you can download this and modify it as you would like. So that is usually there on these instruments if that's an okay thing to do. So appreciate that consideration about copyright. All right. Um, Great. I think we're going to move into our last segment here on analysis and sharing. And we were asked to uh, try to give you some hands-on things and things that'll make your life easier in this section. So we'll try to do that here. So with analyzing and interpreting your data, we have first a little bit of a poll just to see how you feel about a word or phrase that describes how you feel when it's time to analyze. You've got your data in, and now it is time to analyze. And let's see what is a word or phrase that describes your feelings at that point. So we've got we're being a little bit saucy here because we have a word cloud. Um, oops. We've got a word cloud here oh no, it's gone away. Sorry, a word cloud here to show the results. And partly we're being a little bit saucy by trying to show you how a word cloud doesn't, sorry, it's like disappeared from my view now, but how a word cloud is not very helpful insights because it's a kind of frequency of words, which doesn't give you great meaning. But some of the words that people were sharing are a real mix here from excited and hopeful to scary or unsure or annoyed, or feeling curious and feeling like it's an opportunity for storytelling and creativity. So a real range of emotions when it comes to analysis. Sorry, my word cloud disappeared when I tried to share it. So in general, the steps for quantitative analysis are to save an original copy of your data set. That's really important. So that you always have that original copy. You're usually going to do some cleaning and you may decide to move things around as you're analyzing it, and you just want to have one original copy of your data set that you can always go back to. And then you can work on reviewing and cleaning your data. And then going back, you already had that table, as you remember, with your analysis planning. So you're going to run your analysis. So one suggestion that we have here for kind of making things streamlined is to make use of some of the free tools that are out there. Um, so for instance, we have this Google form here of this is just a made up peer leader program survey. And you can see you've got some results and you've got 12 responses in. And so one of the things, we'll just go through some of those steps here together to show you how you can make use of some of the free tools here, which could be helpful to kind of moving things along quickly. And depending on your level of familiarity with like other analysis tools like Excel, maybe make it a little bit easier to get from the survey to results you can share. So we're going to go to responses here, and we're going to get the responses out of this tool into a spreadsheet. And this is, again, allowing us to review the data and also to keep an original data set. So I like to work in Excel, so I'm going to download instead of Google. So I'm going to download a CSV file here. And I'm going to double click to open that up. And so this is what that file looks like when you open it up. I'm going to save it as an Excel file here so that it works like an Excel file. Okay, and so we're going to save this, and this is our original data set. So that's the step number one that we mentioned. Number two would be to think about some cleaning steps. We talked about maybe some scanning for bot activity. So we talked about some advice on that earlier. You also might think about what would be your cutoff for incompletes that you don't want to use. In this case, maybe we'll make the call that this survey here, which only has one answer, one of the Likert scale answers down, is incomplete. And so we're going to delete that one. So that's our third to last survey here. Another thing we might notice as we're looking at this is that these last two are, I made this up, so they are actually exactly the same because I entered it that way for an example. So you could also just see if there are any duplicates, if that was a possibility in the way that you administered your survey and you feel very certain about that, that you could delete any duplicates. So maybe this last one you consider a duplicate. For both of these calls about whether to include or not include partial data or what are you consider duplicates, you probably want to going to err on the side of being conservative and keeping as much data as you can. But if you did want to make any changes, you can kind of look through your data here and consider what changes need to be made. And then when you go back to your form here, you can go to the individual responses And we're going to go to the end. Remember, we were noticing that that one that was third from the end. I'm just going to go through 7, 8, 9, 10 responses. I think this is the one where they only answered that first one and they didn't complete any more of the survey. And we've decided that that one we don't want in our data set. So since we have the original data set, I feel comfortable doing this. I'm going to delete it here. Then the other thing that we noticed is the last two were exactly the same, and maybe we decided we did not want that. It was a duplicate, so we've thought through that carefully, and we've decided we don't want it. I'm going to delete that one. The reason why I'm showing you this is that then you are able to use this sort of automatic analysis that's free and embedded in these free tools. And you can copy charts and put them in a PowerPoint or in a report. So they may not be the most beautiful charts, but it is also getting you to using your data quickly and without relying on analysis, other kinds of skills and software. So we wanted to offer that as an option for you to get to using your survey data. And again, this is just kind of thinking about what you can use. The free tools in your survey software for some basic analysis are there, and you can make good use of those. Just make sure you've got your original data set saved somewhere always in case you make any changes. Another thing that we've talked about in the beginning is that as you are designing your surveys, that you might want to be thinking about how different subgroups in your sample responded to your survey, and some ways that you could do that. If you've got just not too many responses, you might use that spreadsheet that I just downloaded to do some filtering to see how the options, how things look different. Or you might also use a pivot table, which is an Excel tool that helps you compare the answers between different subgroups. So compare, and Katie, I think, do you feel game to do a little demonstration
Yeah,
of
let
how to do
me,
those two things?
yes, let me share my screen quick. All right, and I'm gonna wait for it to tell me that it's sharing. Fantastic. Okay. This is the same survey that Becky was showing on Google Forms already. One of the things that I'd like to recommend first is I've already selected it in this case, but when you're using Excel specifically, you can go to Insert in this top ribbon and click the Table button, and it will automatically turn this into a table that Excel has recognized as being its own discrete thing. Um, from there, I want to talk a little bit about the purpose of pivot tables. Pivot tables are especially useful if you are looking to kind of cull through a larger data set, as Becky was describing. Um, and especially looking to kind of manipulate uh, data quickly. One of the nice things about pivot tables is that you don't need to remember or memorize a whole bunch of Excel formulas. Um, a downside of pivot tables is that they only work with non-numerical data. So since we have words here, and words are not numbers, um, as I was cleaning this data, I went through and I changed these all into numerical values just based on the scale that we were using. Um, for instance, since I was using a 7-point scale, a 7 is going to represent uh, this strongly reflects me on my scale here. Um, so going back to this top ribbon, there is a button right here that says pivot table on it. I'm going to select that button and it's going to pop up a little dialog box. You can see that since I told Excel this is a table, it automatically gives me my table number. It wants to put it in a new worksheet, which sounds great to me. I'm going to click OK. And you can see this little window over here that shows me where my pivot table is going to be. And all of my columns here, representing each of the items on my survey, are shown in this box uh, labeled pivot table fields. So in this example, I know that I have peer leaders who have participated in the program either for 1 year or 2 years. And let's say I wanted to know if there were some differences in their level of comfort speaking up if they witnessed something uh, that was inappropriate, like racist, sexist, or oppressive comments. So, what I can do is it's as simple as selecting the field that I want to look at. I'm going to drag how many years have you been a peer leader to my rows. And you can see it automatically populates with 1 and 2. Those are the number of years that people can be a leader or have been a leader. I'm going to rename this quickly to years as peer leader so I know what it's referring to. And then I know that the second to last option right here says, to what extent do you agree with the following statements? I am prepared to speak up against racist, sexist, or other oppressive comments. Um, let's say I want to know the percentage of people that gave specific responses in to that specific item. I'm actually going to drag that to values in this lower right-hand corner. Um, and you can see what it's automatically done is given me the sum. So adding up all of the numerical responses to that item, I don't want the sum. So if I right click on that, there's this button here, summarize by summarize values by, and let's say I want to actually change it to the average to see what typically are people saying as their um, uh, likelihood or their agreement that they can speak up if they witness these comments. I'm going to change that to average. And now I can see that there is a difference, in fact, between people who have participated for 1 year versus 2 years based on the score that they gave. Um, one last thing that is nice to recognize um, is you can also filter your responses. So I'm going to take one of these fields quickly and drag it down to my filters. You can see that it populates this little bar at the top. Um, so I'm wondering, are people who are more likely to identify as having supportive friends going to be different in how they prepared they feel to speak up? You can see this little drop down caret right here. Um, these are the numerical values associated with each of the different kinds of responses. So my 6 and my 7 are going to be agree or strongly agree. If I click select multiple items, I can unselect the 4. And now it's only showing me the responses for the people who either indicated that they agree or strongly agree. So that is most of it. The last thing I wanted to note is that you can click and drag things from um, kind of quadrant to quadrant here. And if you want to delete anything, I would just right click or click on this little drop down caret and click remove field. This is especially useful if you're looking to analyze data really quickly. You can also generate charts using pivot tables that you may not have available using Google Forms or other kind of built-in software. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I just realized I was muted. Becky, are you speaking? We can't hear you.
Thanks. This is Becky. Thanks, Katie. Yeah, I'm just going over some qualitative analysis tips. And with your open-ended questions to you're going to be coding your data by looking for themes, things that are recurring multiple times, words or phrases that you're going to code those with words or phrases that represent those themes. And when a question that often comes up is about outliers, and maybe that's something that only one or two people experience, but if it feels really relevant and important, that can when you provide that context that maybe only a few people experienced it, but it still feels really important to pay attention to, those are just fine to bring forward. And then or if you are looking at a lot of data, it can be overwhelming. So here's some tips for qualitative analysis. Kind of frequently go back to your questions or your learning questions, and looking to see if the codes that you're making are helping you to answer those questions. And then especially on surveys, it's okay to skip coding all the answers. It really, a lot of times on surveys and open-ended questions, we see a lot of thanks or I don't know, and those might not be very helpful for you understanding, getting answers to your evaluation or learning questions. It's okay to skip those. We have some suggestions here for how to have a conversation, but the big suggestion is to do some kind of collaborative conversation with those who have been involved with the program or affected by it to really interpret your data. Evaluation is about judging, making judgments based on data, and so you're going to want to take a look at the data, your results, your analysis together, and together kind of check what your assumptions are and your biases and different insights that might come from different perspectives. A suggestion is this flow of conversation that's called ORID, where you first start with the facts, maybe a question like what stands out to you. Then you get into feelings or reflections where you might ask, where were you pleased or where were you confused? Then you get into interpretive questions where you're looking at what feels important to take away, and then finally decisions, what answers are emerging to our evaluation questions or what we wanted to learn. So it's just a suggestion for a flow of a conversation. The bigger recommendation is to gather some people who who are going to be affected, who've maybe been involved in giving you advice along the way, and have them weigh in on the interpretation that you're making from your analysis results. And then finally, before we leave you, just a couple notes to pay attention to as you're sharing your results. First, just being really clear about in your reporting about who you're talking about when you're sharing the results. So instead of saying people in Hennepin County think that program services are very helpful, you might instead say survey respondents think these services are very helpful, or survey respondents who are residents in Hennepin County think these programs are very helpful. So just be careful that you're not overgeneralizing who you're speaking about in terms of your survey respondents, and that's defined in your reporting. And then as you're thinking about how to report out, this can look a lot of different ways. And we just, again, invite you to engage and get some advice on this. We could have traditional looking reports with, call outs with your survey results and a lot of text and some pictures. You could also create more of an infographic. This is a picture of an infographic with the title Teenagers and Sexual Violence. We've got different sections for different topic areas with some icons that maybe indicate that align with the results. So we've got, as an example, an icon that's of which kind of showing that different percentages of visualization of the results with different percentages of indicating what the survey respondents said. So as an example, 10%, there's a little visualization of 10%, right by the analysis result, 10% of girls were victimized by a stranger. So just a little bit more visual way of sharing results. This next one is just a picture of a person doing some spoken word and a reminder that you can share results in a lot of ways. They can be storytelling, they can be different creative ways of sharing your results, and you're wanting to do something that's going to get the word out and get the information back to people who are going to be affected by it. And that can look a lot of different ways, not just sort of a traditional report. All right, well, we are going to pause here for some questions before we kind of do our final wrap up. So, if you haven't had a chance to get any questions in on analysis and sharing results, please uh, we'll take this moment to answer some final questions. Okay. We did. There is a practice activity if you wanted to try your hand at working with some data in Excel. We have some different practice activities that I would encourage you to do next before you move on with your day, just to give some of that get some of that solidified before you move on with your day. Since we're coming to the end of our time, I wanted to thank you all for coming today, for your good questions, for your helpful reminders to us, and ideas about ways we can improve, and ideas for your fellow participants. It's been really helpful to have that engagement and participation. So thank you so much. I hope that you are able to use surveys and in a powerful way to give you some good insights in your programs, and feel like you have learned some things about if you wanted to make changes to your survey, that you maybe feel more confident about what to pay attention to in writing questions, that you maybe have some tools to help your analysis go a little bit quicker or more streamlined if you need to do that, or to try your hand at some new techniques if you're wanting to dig deeper into some subgroup analysis and other things. So we hope you've been able to take something helpful away today, and really appreciate you coming and your engagement. We will be sharing the recording and some of the things that we've gone over today. Thank you so much for being here, and wish you all the best in your important work. We really admire the changes that you're making every day in your work. I know it is difficult, and just appreciate you and all your efforts to make our communities better places. So thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate the time.